The listing said historic building, minimal foot traffic. Minimal was generous. It wasn't the foot traffic, exactly. It was the feeling of it being used, even when it wasn't. Like someone had just walked through, brushed past you, even though you knew, logically, you were the only one here. I kept expecting to smell coffee or hear someone humming. It was unsettling. I'd pictured something sleepier, more dust motes dancing in sunbeams. This felt maintained, like it was waiting. The courthouse itself is granite, the kind that looks gray in every light. It's a squat building, not imposing, but solid. 3 stories, mostly windows, though the ones on this side, the back, where the security office is, are smaller, higher up, more like arrow slits. The office itself is a converted storage room, tucked into the basement level. Not a basement in the creepy, cobwebbed sense, more like a ground floor that happens to be partially underground. The air smells like old paper and lemon cleaner. A weird combination. The fluorescent lights hum. A high-pitched whine I already feel settling behind my eyes. Vera, the woman who handed over the keys, didn't say much. Just showed me where the security cameras were, how to lock the doors, and pointed me towards a break room. "Coffee's in the back," she said, and then she was gone. "No good luck or call if you need anything. Just gone." She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days, and she smelled faintly of mothballs. My bag felt heavier than it should. $50,000 in medical bills doesn't exactly disappear just because you take a job guarding an empty courthouse. Every shift is a calculation, another chunk chipped away at the debt. I needed this. I really needed this. The office is small, barely enough room for the desk, the chair, and a narrow filing cabinet. I was looking for somewhere to put my bag when I saw it, a whiteboard on the wall, in a little alcove next to the microwave. Covered in writing. Not a schedule or a memo, but rules. I read the first one. If a phone rings on the premises after 11 p.m., do not answer it. Let it ring. If it stops and immediately starts again, leave the area. That was odd. I pictured some prankster calling, Vera just ignoring it. Probably happened a lot. Old buildings attract weirdos. I moved on. If your footsteps echo in an area where they normally don't, stop walking and stand still for 30 seconds before continuing. Okay, now that was just silly. Acoustics, right? Old buildings do weird things with sound. I've walked through abandoned factories. I know how echoes work. It's just being cautious. The next one. Do not use the service entrance alone. If no one is available to accompany you, use the main entrance regardless of inconvenience. That made sense, I guess? Safety in numbers, though. Again, it felt strangely specific. If you find footprints in dust or debris in an area that should have had no traffic, do not follow them. Note direction and report. Now I was starting to chuckle. Footprints? Seriously? This place can't be that deserted. Maybe someone was trying to scare new hires. If you find ceramic dogs arranged in a triangle on any desk, do not disturb it. Report using code Bluebird. Ceramic dogs? A triangle? What kind of security protocol was this? I briefly imagined the previous guard, a little old lady with a fondness for kitsch, setting up elaborate traps. It was ridiculous. Never backdate a log entry. If you missed a recording window, leave it blank and note the gap. Do not fill it in retroactively even with accurate information. That one was just bureaucratic. Overly specific about paperwork. Probably someone got in trouble once. Do not leave your personal bag, coat, or belongings unattended anywhere on the premises. Keep them with you or locked in your designated locker. That was sensible, standard security procedure. I unlocked the small metal locker in the corner and tossed my bag inside, feeling a little better. At least someone was thinking logically. If your radio or communication device experiences interference in a specific location, static, cutting out, wrong voices, log the location and time. Do not try to boost the signal. Interference. Old wiring, probably. The building was old. I tested the radio. Static crackled, normal for this kind of equipment. Never stand in any doorway on the premises. Pass through completely or stay on one side. A person standing in a doorway belongs to neither space. That one felt wrong. Not dangerous, just off. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. Superstition, definitely. I shook my head. People were strange. The last one. If you see Tobias wearing a dark suit, do not acknowledge him. continue working normally. Tobias? Who the hell was Tobias? And why a dark suit? I glanced around. No sign of anyone, let alone a man in a suit. I snorted. This was a bizarre list, a collection of quirks and anxieties, probably the work of a bored night watchman with too much time on his hands. I checked my watch. 11:57 p.m., 3 minutes to go. Vera hadn't mentioned the rules, hadn't explained anything, just handed me the keys and vanished. I sat down at the desk and stared at the bank of security monitors. Empty hallways, empty rooms. The air felt colder than it had a few minutes ago. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started to whistle, a quiet, nervous habit from childhood. The sound felt hollow in the room. I adjusted the thermostat, but the chill didn't lift, just a prickle on the back of my neck. I glanced at the doorway leading to the hallway, and for a second, just a flicker, I thought I saw something move at the edge of my vision. Nothing, just shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. I was walking the perimeter, checking the windows on the west side. It was mostly just a formality, honestly. The glass was thick, old-fashioned stuff, and the security system was supposed to cover any breaches. Still, Vera had stressed a full walkthrough every 2 hours. "Can't be too careful, Kieran," she'd said, her voice flat. "This building has seen things." I hadn't pressed her on what things. The courthouse was a hulking stone thing, built in the early 1900s. The windows were tall and arched, with heavy iron grates. Most of them looked out onto the deserted streets and darkened parking lots. I shone my flashlight into each window just to be thorough. Dust motes danced in the beam. It smelled like old paper and beeswax polish, a strange combination. Not unpleasant, but definitely old. Like being inside a forgotten library. I'd been trying to calculate how much of my next paycheck would go straight to the hospital bills. It was always the same calculation. Always the same depressing result. Another month of barely treading water. Sarah deserved better. She'd tried so hard to tell me not to take this job, worried about me being alone all night, but we needed the money. She'd been quiet since she got back, though. Not sad, exactly, just distant. The surgery had been a success, but the recovery was slow. I missed her easy laugh. I reached the far end of the west wing, near the records room. The windows here looked out onto a small courtyard, overgrown with weeds. I was about to start back when the phone rang, a shrill, insistent jingle that sliced through the silence. It wasn't the radio and it wasn't my cell, it was one of the landlines, an actual old-fashioned telephone. I paused, frowning. Who would be calling the courthouse at 2:30 in the morning? Probably a wrong number. Or a prank. I glanced at my watch. I'd been on duty for almost 4 hours. Nothing had happened, just quiet and dust and the smell of old paper. I started walking towards the main reception area where the phones were located. The sound stopped after 4 rings. I almost didn't bother going, just a wrong number, like I thought. But as I was about to turn back, it started again, immediately, before the silence had even settled. 4 rings, then silence, then 4 more. My hand froze on the doorknob. That wasn't right. A normal phone call wouldn't do that. It felt deliberate. And then I remembered, or maybe just felt a tug of something half forgotten, a fragment of the whiteboard rules. If a phone rings after hours, don't answer it. Something about it not being from outside. Something about it learning the system. It was a hazy recall, a half-formed impression. I stood there for a moment staring at the phone. It was an old black rotary phone, sitting on a polished mahogany desk. The ringing stopped again. I wanted to pick it up. I wanted to see who was calling. Maybe it was important. Maybe it was someone trying to reach me. Maybe it was Sarah, needing something. But the image of the rule, incomplete and unsettling, kept flashing in my mind. Don't answer. Just leave it. A small voice in my head, surprisingly insistent, told me to obey. It wasn't a feeling of fear, exactly. More like a pressure, a tightening in my chest. I didn't understand why, but I felt like answering that phone would be a mistake, a significant one. I turned and walked away. I didn't run, but I moved quickly, heading back towards the security office. I needed to log this, needed to write down the time, the location, the bizarre ringing pattern. As I reached the office, I realized I hadn't finished my perimeter check. I hadn't checked the last 3 windows on the west side, the ones overlooking the courtyard. I hesitated. It would only take a few minutes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't go back. That something had shifted while I was walking away from that phone. I glanced at the security monitors. Everything looked normal. Empty hallways, empty rooms. But the chill in the air felt more pronounced now, and I couldn't get the image of that phone, ringing and ringing, out of my head. I made a note in the log, time and location, and then I sat back down at the desk, a growing sense of unease settling over me. I had a feeling those last 3 windows weren't going to be checked tonight, and I had a gnawing suspicion that whatever I was avoiding was already aware of the gap in my patrol. I was straightening the chairs in the old jury waiting room. It was a pointless task, really. Nobody ever used that room anymore. Trials were mostly held in the newer wing, and the few times a jury was needed for the historical courtroom, they used folding chairs brought in from storage, but Mr. Walt, the day supervisor, had made a point of saying he liked things tidy, and tidy meant occupied, apparently. So I was carefully aligning the worn velvet chairs, making sure the backs were all the same distance from the wall. The room was cold, even for the courthouse. The heating system was ancient, and they kept it pretty low overnight to save money. I could see my breath misting in the air as I moved. I'd been doing this job for almost a month now, and I'd gotten used to the chill. It was a small price to pay for a steady paycheck. Sarah's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves, and the insurance company was still fighting over half of them. Every little bit helped. I whistled softly under my breath, a habit I'd had since I was a kid. It was a nervous thing, I guess, but it helped me focus. I finished with the chairs and started to walk towards the door, intending to move on to the small library off the main hall. The floor was polished concrete, always a little dusty. I took a few steps, and that's when I heard it. A faint repetition of my footsteps, an echo. But it wasn't a normal echo. The room was small, square, and mostly furnished. There wasn't anything to echo off of. I'd walked through this room dozens of times, and it had never echoed before. It was just dead sound. I stopped walking, frowning. It had to be my imagination. The building was old, and the acoustics were weird. Maybe the temperature was playing tricks on my ears. Or maybe I was just tired. I hadn't been sleeping well lately, worrying about the bills, about Sarah. I took another step, and there it was again. A distinct hollow echo following right behind me. It wasn't a loud echo, more like a ghost of a sound, but it was definitely there. Then, the whiteboard flashed in my mind. Not a clear image, but a feeling. Something about sound and stillness, a rule about echoes. If your footsteps echo where they shouldn't, stop walking for 30 seconds. That was all I could remember. Fragments. It felt less like recalling a rule and more like remembering a warning, a primal urge to freeze. Without thinking, I stopped dead in my tracks. I stood perfectly still, my hands hanging at my sides, listening. The echo continued. Not a single, repeating echo of my last step, but a constant, subtle reverberation, as if the room itself was breathing, mimicking my presence even though I wasn't moving. It was unsettling, deeply unsettling. I counted to 30, slowly, deliberately. Each second felt like an eternity. The echo didn't fade, it didn't change, it just was. When I reached 30, I didn't move. I didn't dare. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something to happen, for the echo to stop, for some explanation, but nothing happened. The echo simply continued, a constant, unnerving presence. Finally, after what felt like a full minute, I very slowly, deliberately turned around and walked back the way I came. I didn't hurry. I didn't run. I just walked, carefully placing one foot in front of the other, until I was out of the jury waiting room and back in the hallway. The echo stopped the moment I crossed the threshold. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My heart was doing a strange, fluttery thing, not racing exactly, but off-kilter. I felt profoundly drained and cold. The hallway felt colder than before. I glanced back at the door to the jury waiting room. It looked normal, perfectly ordinary, but I knew something was different. Something had changed in that room, and I had a very strong feeling I wasn't going to go back in there tonight. I made a note in the security log, unusual acoustic anomaly, jury waiting room. Echo present when no echo should be. I didn't mention the rule. I didn't mention the 30 seconds. It felt private, like something I needed to keep to myself. As I finished writing, I noticed my hands were slick with a cold sweat. It wasn't the temperature. It felt like the room had left something on my skin, something that wouldn't wash off. I capped my pen and closed the log, realizing I hadn't whistled once since I stepped into that room. I was restocking the visitor information pamphlets. It was a stupid task, honestly. Most people just asked me where things were, and the pamphlets were always a mess by the end of the night, stuffed into the wrong racks, dog-eared, covered in coffee rings. But it was something to do, something to occupy my hands and my mind, even if it was mind-numbingly boring. The courthouse had these little rotating racks, the kind you see at airport hotels. I was pulling out the outdated brochures, a tourism guide from 2018, a list of local bed and breakfasts, most of which had probably gone out of business, and replacing them with the newer versions. The pamphlets were cool to the touch, the slick paper slightly damp from the humidity. It smelled like old paper and cheap ink. I whistled a bit of an old tune, something my dad used to like, a jaunty little number that felt wrong in this place. Everything felt wrong in this place, if I was honest with myself, but it was a job, a steady paycheck. And Sarah needed the insurance. I had to focus. Fold, insert, rotate. Fold, insert, rotate. I glanced at my watch, 3:17 a.m. My next perimeter check wasn't scheduled for another 40 minutes, but I was running behind on my cleaning duties. Old man Hemmings, the day supervisor, was a stickler for detail. He'd been working at the courthouse for 40 years and treated it like his own personal kingdom. I needed to get the lobby spotless before he arrived. That meant vacuuming, polishing the brass railings, and emptying the trash. The quickest way to the supply closet was through the service entrance. It was just around the back, a heavy steel door that led directly into the janitorial storage room. The main entrance was all the way around the front of the building, a longer walk, but it meant navigating the main lobby again, and I really didn't want to walk through the main lobby again, not after the echo, not tonight. I was already walking towards the back of the building thinking about shortcuts when I noticed the smell. It wasn't strong, more of a presence, like something metallic, but not blood, more like old pipes or maybe a garage. It was faint, but it was definitely there, and it was coming from the direction of the service entrance. I paused, frowning. That was odd. I hadn't smelled anything like that before. Then, a flicker. At the very edge of my peripheral vision, a shadow moving across the brick wall too fast to be a person. I blinked, and it was gone. Probably just a trick of the light. The security lights outside were old and flickered sometimes. Still, it made my stomach clench. I remembered something, a fragmented, unsettling impression from the whiteboard. Something about shortcuts and doors, something about not being alone. Don't use the service entrance if you're alone. That's all I could grasp. Vague, incomplete, but enough to stop me. I stopped walking. My throat felt tight. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just a smell, a shadow, my imagination running wild. I was tired, stressed. I needed to get back to work. It was just a quicker route. What harm could it possibly do? But the smell was still there, clinging to the air. And the flicker, even though I knew it was probably nothing, had left a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I turned around and started walking in the opposite direction, towards the main entrance. It added 2 minutes to the walk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I went through the main doors, flashed my security badge at the silent reception desk, and continued towards the supply closet. The lobby was even colder than before, the marble floor radiating a chill that seeped into my shoes. I grabbed the cleaning supplies, resisting the urge to look back. I was definitely going to have to explain the extra time to Hemmings. He wasn't going to be pleased. As I walked back towards the lobby, I noticed something else. The echo from the jury waiting room was gone. Completely. I hadn't realized how much it had been bothering me until it vanished. The silence was wrong. It felt like something had been removed, like a piece of the building was missing. I double-checked the locking mechanism on the service entrance door as I passed it, just to be sure. It was secure. But the smell lingered, faint but persistent. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had avoided something I hadn't even seen. I finished my cleaning and logged the incident, simply noting a slight odor near the service entrance and an absence of the previous acoustic anomaly. I didn't write about the shadow. I didn't write about the rule. I didn't mention the feeling of being watched. I just finished my shift and waited for 6 a.m. And I didn't whistle, not once. The fluorescent lights in the records room hummed, a high-pitched whine that settled into your teeth after a while. I was cataloging old case files, mostly traffic violations and minor property disputes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a task, a defined task, and right now defined tasks were good. Vera had been complaining about the laundry piling up, and I'd promised to tackle it when I got home. I needed to stay focused, get this done, and get home. The files were stored in cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling. Dust motes danced in the weak light, coating everything in a fine gray film. I wore a mask, but it didn't really help. My nose still itched. I was going through the boxes alphabetically, pulling out files that were past their retention date and marking them for shredding. It was monotonous work, but it gave me something to do with my hands, something to distract me from the bills and the worry and the quiet that followed me around like a shadow. I'd been at it for almost 2 hours, and the room was starting to feel smaller. The air was thick and stale, and the hum of the lights was getting louder. I paused, rubbing my eyes, and took a sip of lukewarm coffee from my thermos. It tasted like burnt pennies, but it was better than nothing. I whistled a little tune under my breath, an old jazz standard my father used to play. Trying to remember the melody was a small comfort. I shifted a stack of boxes to reach one at the very back, and that's when I saw them, footprints. In the dust on the floor, clear, distinct footprints leading down a narrow corridor that dead-ended in a storage closet. The corridor hadn't been used in years. I knew that for a fact. Hemmings told me himself. He said it was blocked off after some structural issues, and he hadn't bothered to get it fixed. He just put up a "Do Not Enter" sign and forgot about it. They weren't the scuff marks of someone brushing past. These were full, deliberate steps. Someone had walked down that corridor, leaving a clear trail in the undisturbed dust. My first thought was maintenance. Maybe someone had disregarded the sign, but that seemed unlikely. Zeb, the day porter, was meticulous. He wouldn't ignore a "Do Not Enter" sign. He'd complain about it for a week. And the prints, they weren't work boots. They were ordinary shoes, like sneakers. It was probably just an overzealous volunteer, someone helping with the archives a while back. Or maybe a contractor before I started. Something perfectly explainable. It had to be. Still, my hand moved towards my radio, then stopped. I remembered something, a vague impression from the whiteboard. Something about footprints and direction. Something about noting where they lead and not following. It wasn't a clear recollection, more a sense of unease, a warning. If you find prints, note the direction. That's all I could retrieve. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just staring at the footprints. I could easily walk down that corridor myself, see what was at the end of it. Confirm it was nothing, put my mind at ease. It was a 20-second walk, but the image of the whiteboard flickered in my mind, a nagging feeling that I shouldn't. That something about those footprints was wrong. I grabbed my notepad and carefully sketched the pattern of the prints, the size, the direction. I noted the date and time, the type of dust, everything. I even measured the length of the corridor. I filled a whole page with observations, anything to avoid actually doing anything. Then I logged that I'd found them in the incident log. Footprints discovered in the records room corridor. Direction, towards storage closet. Area inaccessible. No further action taken. Sounded official enough. The echo from the jury waiting room was still absent. It was a small thing, but it continued to bother me. I hadn't consciously been thinking about it, but now that I was still, the silence felt oppressive. It seemed to amplify the hum of the lights, the scratch of my pen, the feeling of being watched. I finished the log entry, closed my notepad, and stood up. I didn't look down the corridor. I didn't even glance towards the storage closet. I just turned around and started restacking the boxes, carefully avoiding looking in that direction. The fluorescent lights seemed to flicker a little brighter, and I had the distinct sensation of a cold draft on the back of my neck. I didn't whistle. I hadn't whistled in hours, and I wouldn't be whistling anytime soon. I had to tell Vera about the laundry, and I needed to get home. I needed to see her. That was all that mattered. I finished cataloging the files, the weight of the boxes feeling heavier than before, and started to pack up my things. I had a feeling this would be a long night and a longer morning. I needed to figure out how to explain the delay to Hemmings. But right now, all I could think about was the dust, the footprints, and the silent corridor leading to nowhere. I was on the third floor checking the records storage room. It wasn't a glamorous task, just making sure all the file cabinets were locked and the windows were secure. Most of the files were decades old, divorce decrees and property settlements from before my time. The air up there was always stale, thick with the smell of paper and something else, a faint, dry odor like old pennies, although I knew that was impossible. It wasn't a strong smell, just a ghost of one. I'd gotten used to it. The courthouse was old, full of ghosts of all kinds, I figured. The room was mostly full of cabinets, arranged in long rows, with narrow aisles between them. I used a small flashlight to check the locks, running my fingers along the metal. It was quieter up there, too. The hum of the fluorescent lights was less noticeable, and the distant traffic noise didn't reach as easily. It was peaceful, if you ignored the sheer volume of forgotten paperwork. I was trying to whistle a tune, something Vera liked, but it kept coming out flat and hesitant. My throat felt tight. I was working my way along the back wall when I saw it. Not something immediately alarming, just odd. On the floor, in the center of the aisle, someone had arranged a collection of paperclips. Not just dropped them, arranged them. They formed a perfect circle, about 1 foot in diameter. Shiny silver against the faded linoleum. It wasn't a large number of paper clips, maybe 30 to 40, but it wasn't random. They were all facing the same direction, neatly spaced. It looked deliberate. I paused. My flashlight beam fixed on the circle, probably just someone with too much time on their hands. A bored clerk maybe, or one of the interns. Kids do weird things. They think it's funny to leave little art installations around. I almost reached down to sweep them away. It was untidy, a potential tripping hazard. And Vera hated clutter. I was constantly trying to keep the house neat for her, and seeing that circle of paper clips made my teeth itch. But then a flash of something, a phrase, fragmented and unsettling, surfaced from the jumble of information Hemmings had given me on my first day, something about patterns, and not disturbing them. It wasn't the footprints, but it felt related. A similar caution, don't alter arrangements. That was it, vague, incomplete, but undeniably there. A warning. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the paper clips. It was ridiculous, of course. A bunch of paper clips, but the feeling of unease was growing, heavier now, pressing on my chest. I could easily kick them aside, be done with it. No harm, no foul. But the image of that phrase, don't alter, stuck in my mind. I pulled out my notepad and, with a deliberate slowness, sketched the arrangement. The circle. The direction the paper clips faced. The distance from the cabinets. I made a note of the time. Then, carefully, I opened the incident log and wrote, "Unusual arrangement of office supplies discovered in record storage room. Pattern, circular. No interaction, reporting as per protocol." I used the code, unusual arrangement, that seemed to fit. Hemmings had emphasized the importance of proper documentation. I closed the log, my hand still trembling slightly. The echo from the jury waiting room hadn't returned. That was odd. It had been present for days, and now it was just gone. It wasn't a relief, though. The silence felt different now, not empty but expectant. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the dark glass of a file cabinet. But it wasn't just my reflection. Behind me, in the aisle where the paper clips were, something flickered. A distortion of the light, a momentary blurring of the shapes. It lasted only a fraction of a second, and when I turned back there was nothing there. Just the rows of file cabinets, the faded linoleum, and the circle of silver paper clips, gleaming innocently in the dim light. I didn't look again. I didn't need to. I knew whatever I'd almost seen wasn't meant for me to see. I walked quickly out of the records room, closing the door firmly behind me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and I felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I needed to check the security cameras, see if anything had been recorded, but I knew somehow that they wouldn't show anything. They never did. I still hadn't whistled, and I didn't think I would tonight. The tightness in my chest hadn't eased. It felt like something was pressing in, a silent weight. The phone hadn't rung since the initial barrage, but I kept anticipating it. waiting for the jarring sound to break the silence. I checked the cameras for the third time. Nothing. The corridors were empty. The rooms were still. But something had changed. The air felt heavier, colder, and the silence. The silence was no longer empty. It was listening. I needed to finish my rounds. I needed to get through the night, and I needed to figure out what in God's name was happening. But mostly, I needed to get home to Vera. I had a feeling this was going to be a very long night, and tomorrow would be even worse. I was checking the holding cells. Routine empty, of course. No one was held overnight anymore. Budget cuts, they said. Everything went to the county facility 20 miles away. Still had to check them, though. Part of the protocol. The metal of the bars was cold under my fingertips as I ran a hand along them, checking for any sign of tampering. Ridiculous. Who would even bother? The cells smelled like stale air and disinfectant, a peculiar combination that clung to the back of my throat. It wasn't a strong smell, but it was constant, pervasive. I'd gotten used to it, I guess. The fluorescent lights flickered in the corner of cell block C, a familiar, irritating buzz. I made a mental note to put in a maintenance request. It probably wouldn't get done for weeks. Everything moved slowly around here. I finished the cells and moved on to the Sally port. The big metal gate was down, as usual. I checked the locking mechanisms, the sensors, everything. It was tedious work, but it was work. And work meant a paycheck. A paycheck meant keeping Vera's medical bills from piling up even higher. She hadn't complained, not really, but I saw the worry in her eyes, the way she flinched when the mail came. It was during the Sally port check that I realized I'd messed up. I'd been so focused on the cells, on making sure I hadn't missed anything, that I hadn't logged the time. 2:17 a.m. I was supposed to record my position every half hour. Hemmings had been very specific about that. Creates a verifiable record of your movements, he'd said. For security purposes, I glanced at my watch again. 2:23. 6 minutes gone. Not a huge deal, but still, a gap. I immediately reached for the logbook, my pen hovering over the blank space. I could easily fill it in. 2:17 a.m. Sally port check, all secure. No one would know the difference. It wouldn't matter. It was just 6 minutes, just a small oversight. But something, a faint echo of that fragmented warning about arrangements, held my hand back, a feeling that doing so would be wrong. Not illegal, not dangerous, just wrong. I dismissed it as exhaustion. It was late and I hadn't slept well in days. Worry about Vera, the new job, the constant feeling of being watched, it was all catching up to me. It was just 6 minutes. But the fragment persisted. Something about not changing things. Not retroactively changing things. I remembered Hemmings saying something during the orientation about the importance of accurate timing in the logs. Something about the building responding to the records. It sounded absurd now, even to me. But the feeling of unease lingered. I sighed, and instead of filling in the missing time, I wrote, 2:23 a.m. Sally port check, all secure note. 6-minute gap in log due to oversight during cell block C check. Gap not backdated. It felt wrong. Leaving it blank felt like admitting failure, like leaving a hole in the record, but the alternative felt worse. As soon as I finished writing, the overhead lights in the Sally port flickered violently, then died, plunging the area into near darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, casting a sickly yellow glow, but it wasn't enough. The sudden darkness made my stomach lurch. I blinked, trying to adjust my vision. It wasn't a power outage. I could hear the hum of the lights in the corridor, the faint buzzing of the security system. Just the Sally port. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling with the switch. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, I swept it across the Sally port. Everything looked normal. The gate was down, the locks were secure. But then I saw it, scratched into the metal of the gate. Just below the locking mechanism were 3 lines, deep, deliberate scratches like someone had used a key or a tool to create them. They hadn't been there before, I was certain of it. I'd examined the gate carefully just moments ago. The scratches weren't symbols, just random lines. But they were new, and they felt directed, like they were meant for me to see, a response, a reaction to the gap in the log. I shined the flashlight around again, but there was nothing else. No footprints, No other marks, just the 3 lines. A silent accusation. I stood there for a long moment, my breath catching in my throat. The echo from the jury waiting room, which hadn't returned since the circle of paperclips, was back, faint but distinct. And it sounded different now. Less like an echo, more like a whisper. I finished my rounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. A small mistake, perhaps, but a mistake nonetheless. I'd done the right thing according to Hemming's instructions. I had left the gap in the log, refused to alter the past, but now, staring at those scratches, I wondered if following the rules had somehow made things worse. If leaving that 6-minute gap hadn't prevented something, but invited it. The lights in the Sally port were still out when I left. I didn't report it. I didn't want to add another entry to the log, another record of my failure. I just wanted to get through the night. And I knew with a sinking feeling that getting home to Vera was going to be even harder than I thought, because the front gate, the main entrance to the courthouse, was now locked, and the keycard reader wasn't responding. I was cataloging maintenance requests. Old ones, mostly. Requests from before the renovations, before the budget cuts. The forms were yellowed and brittle, the handwriting faded. Mostly leaky faucets, broken tiles, flickering fluorescent bulbs. Tedious stuff. It was a quiet task, tucked away in the records room on the 3rd floor, and I appreciated the quiet. The courthouse was never truly silent. Even at 3 in the morning, there was the hum of the HVAC system, the occasional creak of the building settling, the distant wail of a siren. But the records room, it felt separate, removed. The room itself was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, crammed with filing cabinets and stacks of boxes. The single window overlooked the back parking lot, offering a view of nothing but asphalt and the skeletal branches of a few scrub trees. It smelled like dust and old paper, a dry, papery smell that clung to the back of my throat. I had a cup of lukewarm coffee sitting on the corner of the desk, and I kept glancing at it, willing myself to take another sip. But it just didn't appeal. Vera had made it before she went to bed, and I hadn't wanted to hurt her feelings by not finishing it. I'd already managed a few polite swallows. I was sorting through a stack of requests from 2018 when the phone rang. Not the landline in the Sally port. Thankfully, that thing had gone silent after everything. This was the extension on the desk in the records room. I hesitated before picking it up. I didn't expect anyone to be calling at this hour. It was probably a wrong number, or Hemming's wanting to check on something. I braced myself. "Courthouse security, Kieran speaking," I said, keeping my voice even. Silence. Just static. I held the phone to my ear for a moment longer, then hung it up. Probably a glitch. The system was old, prone to errors. I made a note of it in the log, 3:47 a.m., brief static call on records room extension, assumed malfunction, and went back to the maintenance requests. I was about halfway through the stack when I remembered I'd left my bag in the break room. My good backpack, the one Vera got me for my birthday. It had my wallet, my phone, a couple of granola bars, my spare glasses. I hadn't even thought about it. I'd been so focused on the log, on the scratches, on getting through the night. I remembered Hemming's orientation, the dry recitation of rules, something about personal belongings, not leaving them unattended, a vague sense of exposure. I couldn't quite recall the specifics, just a strong impression of needing to keep everything with me. It was probably nothing, just a standard security precaution, but the feeling that prickling at the back of my neck was back. I stood up, pushing the chair back with a scrape against the linoleum floor. The echo was faint, but I heard it, just a ghost of a sound, but it was there. I told myself it was the coffee wearing off, or the stress, or the fact that I hadn't slept properly in a week. I just needed to get my bag and get back to work. I headed for the door, leaving the stack of maintenance requests on the desk. The break room was on the opposite side of the building, down a long corridor. The corridor was dimly lit, the overhead lights buzzing softly. I walked quickly, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. I passed the jury waiting room, and the air grew colder. I didn't hear the echo this time, but I felt the space, empty and waiting. The break room was empty, as usual. It was a small, sterile space with a chipped formica table and a couple of mismatched chairs. My bag was exactly where I'd left it, slung over the back of one of the chairs. I breathed a sigh of relief. See? Nothing to worry about. Just my imagination running wild. I walked over to the bag and reached for the strap. That's when I noticed it. A small silver pen, my pen, the one Vera gifted me for finishing the hospital bill's paperwork, was lying on the floor, a few inches from the bag. It hadn't fallen out of the bag, I was certain of that. The main compartment was zipped shut. It had been placed there deliberately. I froze. A wave of nausea washed over me, and my throat constricted. I hadn't dropped the pen. I hadn't even taken it out of the bag. It just appeared. I snatched up the bag, slung it over my shoulder, and practically ran back to the records room. I didn't bother checking anything else. Didn't bother looking for any other signs. I just wanted to get back to the relative safety of that small, dusty room. Back in the records room, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart thudding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I sat down, carefully placing my bag on the desk, within arm's reach. The pen was still clutched in my hand. I stared at it, turning it over and over. It was just a pen, a small silver pen, but it felt wrong, contaminated. I didn't understand what had happened, didn't understand why the pen was on the floor, but I knew with a chilling certainty that leaving my bag unattended had been a mistake that had opened something up, something I didn't want to know about, something I couldn't explain. And I knew, just as surely, that whatever it wasn't interested in my pen, it was interested in me. I added a note to the log. 4:02 a.m., retrieved personal belongings from break room. Noted displaced item. Increased vigilance advised. I didn't mention the feeling, the dread, the certainty that something had changed. I just recorded the facts, or what I thought were the facts. And I started sorting through the maintenance requests again, but my hands were slick with sweat, and the smell of dust and old paper suddenly felt suffocating. The quiet felt different now. Not peaceful, but expectant. Like the building itself was holding its breath. I was checking the fire extinguishers. It was on the list. A monthly visual inspection. Each one had a pressure gauge, a little green needle pointing to, okay, tedious, but it beat staring at the blank security monitor. The courthouse was quiet, predictably so. It was 5:30 a.m., the deepest part of the night. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed subdued. The extinguishers were all along the corridor leading to the old evidence lockup, the one I'd been avoiding. Not because of the footprints, not anymore. The footprints didn't bother me. They were just there. It was the corridor itself. Narrow, low-ceilinged, with those sickly yellow walls. It always felt colder down there, even though the HVAC system seemed to work fine. I checked the gauge on the first extinguisher. Green. Moved to the next. Green. I was whistling. A little tune my grandfather used to hum. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I caught myself. It's a nervous habit, I guess. I hadn't whistled like that in years. It felt childish. I stopped abruptly. The radio clipped to my belt crackled. Static. Nothing unusual. Reception in that part of the building was always spotty. I'd mentioned it to Vera when I started the job. She'd just said old buildings did that. It's the wiring, Kieran. It's probably ancient. She was right, probably. The building was ancient, built in 1902. They said, I reached the fifth extinguisher, checked the gauge. Green. The static on the radio intensified. It wasn't the usual crackle. It was layered, like something was trying to push through. I instinctively adjusted the volume dial, trying to clear it up, just static. But then for a split second, I thought I heard something underneath. A voice, garbled, distorted, but definitely a voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. Not a dispatcher, not a patrol officer, just noise resolving into the shape of speech. It cut out before I could make out a single word. A burst of pure static, then silence. I blinked, shaking my head. Fatigue, that's all it was. I hadn't slept well since starting this job. The stress about the bills, the weirdness of the building, it was catching up to me. My eyes felt gritty, and the back of my throat was dry. Just a trick of the ear. Old wiring, Vera said. I started to move towards the next extinguisher, further down the corridor, to get it over with. I was almost past the point where the signal usually died completely, almost to where the voice had been. Then, the static returned, even louder this time, and the radio's plastic casing warmed against my belt. Not hot, but undeniably warmer than it had been. It was a subtle heat, but I felt it, and a high-pitched whine started to build, overlaid on the static. It was making my teeth ache. I stopped. My hand hovered over the next extinguisher. I didn't need to check it. I knew it would be green. They all were, but something felt wrong. The warmth of the radio, the whine, the way the static felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. It wasn't just interference. It was something happening. I remembered something from the binder. Something about communication devices. Interference in a specific location. Don't try to boost the signal. Log the location. The words weren't clear in my head, fragmented and blurry. But the core message was there. Something about not fighting it, not trying to fix it, just documenting it. I pulled the radio off my belt. The whine increased. Almost painful now. The plastic was getting uncomfortably warm. I fumbled for the notepad and pen in my pocket, my fingers clumsy and slow. I scribbled down the location, evidence lock-up corridor, approximately 20 feet from extinguisher number 6, and the time 5:34 a.m. Then, under that, radio interference, possible vocalizations detected within static. I didn't mention the warmth, the whine. It sounded ridiculous even to me. I clipped the radio back onto my belt, keeping my hand away from it. The static didn't disappear, but the whine subsided slightly. The warmth remained. I finished checking the extinguishers, quickly and efficiently, avoiding looking at the radio, all green. I didn't go back to the records room. Instead, I walked straight to the main security desk and updated the log. Fire extinguisher check completed. Corridor to evidence lockup experiencing radio interference. See 5:34 a.m. entry. Simple, factual. I sat back down, staring at the blank security monitors. The silence felt heavier now. Different. I reached for my coffee, but my hand stopped midair. The mug felt cold. I hadn't noticed that before. I took a sip anyway. It tasted stale. I glanced down at the radio. The static continued, a constant, unsettling presence. And then I noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible smell, like ozone, like something electrical had burned out. It wasn't strong, but it was there, lingering in the air. I hadn't smelled that before. It made the back of my nose tingle. I rubbed my eyes, trying to dispel the feeling of unease. It wasn't working. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. The smell was still there, and the static, it sounded less like random noise now, more like waiting. I reached for my coffee again, and this time I noticed a small, hairline crack running down the side of the mug. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. I was doing inventory in the old jury deliberation room. It was pleasant, surprisingly. Sunlight streamed through the frosted glass of the single window, warming the heavy oak table. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Not unpleasant, like some of the other parts of the building. I was cataloging the boxes of unused jury duty questionnaires, making sure they hadn't gotten damp or infested with anything. Tedious, but at least quiet and warm. It was getting colder outside, October really tightening its grip. The questionnaires themselves were a trip. All the same questions, repeated endlessly. Do you believe you can be fair and impartial? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? People's handwriting, too. Some careful and precise, others frantic and barely legible. You could almost feel the weight of their lives in those little loops and slants. I was whistling softly, a habit I fall into when I'm concentrating. Something my mother used to tell me to stop doing, said it drove her crazy. I'd been at it for nearly an hour, stacking the boxes neatly against the wall, when Vera called over the radio. Just a routine check-in. Everything quiet over there, Kieran? Her voice sounded tinny and distant. Quiet as a tomb, Vera, I said, trying to inject some cheerfulness into my voice. Just wrestling with a mountain of paperwork. Stay warm, she said, And don't go poking around where you shouldn't." "Wouldn't dream of it," I told her, though I knew she was probably referring to the blocked-off corridor. I hadn't been back there since finding those footprints. The thought of it still gave me a little prickle of unease. I went back to the questionnaires, humming along with the tune in my head. The door to the deliberation room was open, leading into the hallway. I paused mid-stack, looking at the boxes. I needed to move them further back, closer to the wall. It was a minor thing, but I liked things orderly. I took a step toward the doorway, then stopped. I didn't know why I stopped. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was like something held me there. Half in, half out. One foot still fully in the room, one just over the threshold. I felt a slight chill, a drop in temperature. It wasn't significant. Not enough to warrant a jacket, but noticeable. And the air felt different, stiller. I told myself it was just the draft from the hallway. The building was old, notoriously drafty. The heating system was ancient. It was probably just a cold spot. I started to step forward again, to complete the movement into the hallway, and the chill intensified. It wasn't just colder, it was heavy, like a weight pressing down on me. It was stupid. I knew. It was a doorway, a simple opening between two rooms, but something felt profoundly wrong. I remembered a line from the binder, something about doorways, not about avoiding them specifically, more of a caution, something about not being in the doorway, about belonging, about a space needing to claim you. It was all vague, half-remembered. I'd skimmed that section quickly, focusing on the more concrete rules. I dismissed it as overly cautious bureaucratic language. But now, standing there, feeling that weight, that chill, I wasn't so sure. It felt less like bureaucracy and more like instruction, like a fundamental rule of the building. I took a breath, trying to steady my nerves. I was being ridiculous. It was a cold spot. That's all it was. I could feel myself starting to sweat, the fine hairs on my arms rising. I needed to just move. I took a deliberate step backwards, fully into the deliberation room. The chill didn't dissipate immediately, but it lessened. The heavy feeling lifted, just a little. I took another step back, and then another, until I was standing well away from the doorway. The room felt normal again, warm, comfortable, safe. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath. Honestly, I was embarrassed. I was letting an old building get to me. I needed to get a grip. I turned back to the boxes of questionnaires, determined to finish the inventory and put the whole thing behind me. But as I reached for the next box, I noticed something. The sunlight streaming through the window had changed. It wasn't as bright, less golden. It was a subtle shift, but definitely there, and the lemon polish smell was gone, replaced by something else, something metallic, like old pennies or blood. I didn't say anything. I didn't radio Vera. I just started stacking the boxes faster. I was cataloging the old case files, mostly traffic violations, some minor theft, stuff that had been archived years ago. It was tedious, but it kept me moving. I liked moving. Standing still gave me too much time to think. The fluorescent lights hummed, a constant low thrum that vibrated in my teeth. I'd started noticing the little things, the way the linoleum tiles were slightly warped, the chipped paint on the baseboards. I hadn't realized how much detail you registered when you were actively trying not to notice anything else. The files were in no particular order, just stacked in cardboard boxes. I was alphabetizing them, a task Vera had assigned me to keep me occupied. She'd said it was good for morale. Honestly, I think she just didn't want me wandering around. I whistled softly, a little tune my grandmother used to hum. It helped me focus, kept the anxiety at bay. The medical bills were always there, a dull ache in the back of my mind. This job was just a stopgap, a way to keep the lights on. I reached for a box labeled MO and pulled it onto my lap. The cardboard was brittle, flaking dust with every movement. I started sorting through the files, scanning the names, the dates, the charges. Nothing out of the ordinary. A speeding ticket here, a shoplifting arrest there. Just the mundane detritus of everyday life. The air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. It wasn't a bad smell, just old. I was about halfway through the box when I noticed him. He was standing near the water cooler, by the hallway leading to the judge's chambers. An older man, maybe in his 70s, wearing a dark suit. He wasn't a lawyer. I was sure of it. I'd seen all the lawyers who frequented the building, and this man didn't fit. He was just standing there, perfectly still, watching me. He didn't look at me, exactly. His gaze seemed to be fixed on a point just past my shoulder, and it wasn't a normal gaze. It was flat, empty, like looking into a void. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. The fluorescent lights were probably making me see things. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand and looked again. He was still there. I told myself he was a visitor, waiting for someone. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was just admiring the architecture. This building was pretty ornate for a courthouse. It had been built in the early 1900s, all marble and mahogany. I'd read about it in the employee handbook. It was supposed to be a landmark, but the man just didn't fit. He felt wrong, out of place. Then I remembered. The binder. The thick, cream-colored binder Vera had given me on my first day. The binder with all the rules. I didn't recall anything specific about a man standing by the water cooler, but I remembered a section about seeing things, about ignoring things. There was a rule about not acknowledging certain presences, about maintaining normalcy. Something about not giving them power. I couldn't remember the exact wording. It was all a blur, but the gist of it was clear. If you saw something you shouldn't, you pretended you hadn't. It was probably just some old guy, a harmless eccentric. I was letting my nerves get the better of me. I was overthinking things. I needed to focus on the files. I took a deep breath and deliberately averted my gaze, returning my attention to the MO box. I started sorting through the files again, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. But I couldn't ignore it. I could still feel his presence, even without looking. It was like a weight in the room, a pressure in the air. I focused on the names, the dates, the charges, reciting them under my breath. Michael Abernathy, reckless driving, March 14, 2018. Olivia Barnes, petty theft, June 22, 2015. I kept my head down, my hands moving. I risked another glance. He hadn't moved, still standing by the water cooler, still staring at that point just past my shoulder. Except he was closer now. He'd taken a step or two. He hadn't made a sound. No footsteps, no rustling of clothes. He'd just moved. I forced myself to look away. I was being ridiculous. It was the exhaustion, the stress, the constant humming of the lights. I needed a break. I stood up, stretching my back. I needed to walk around, clear my head. I told myself I was just being paranoid. As I stood up, I noticed something else. The radio Vera had given me, the one I was supposed to keep on my person at all times, was emitting a low, static hiss. It wasn't the usual static. This was different. It was deeper, more resonant. And it was coming from the direction of the man by the water cooler. The radio interference rule. It was happening again. I didn't say anything. I didn't radio Vera. I didn't even look at the man again. I grabbed my notepad and pen and meticulously documented the time, my location, and the presence of the radio interference. The protocol demanded it. I wrote everything down, my hand shaking slightly. Then, I resumed sorting the files, deliberately avoiding any glance in his direction. I finished the MO box, then started on PR. The radio static continued, a persistent, unnerving hum. I could still feel his presence, a cold spot in the periphery of my vision. I didn't look up. I didn't acknowledge him. I just kept working. After 1 hour, the static stopped. And when I finally cautiously risked a glance, he was gone, vanished. No sound, no movement, just gone. But the air felt colder, and the lemon polish smell, that faintly cheerful scent the cleaning crew used, was completely overwhelmed by something else, something I hadn't smelled before, something like dust and wet stone. I finished cataloging the files, the silence pressing in on me. I logged the end of my task, resisting the urge to add anything about the man. The rules didn't cover reporting these things, only responding to them, and the response, it seemed, was silence. I shut down the computer, gathered my things, and walked toward the exit. As I passed the water cooler, I noticed something on the floor. A single dark feather. It didn't belong to any bird I knew. It was too long, too sleek, too black. It wasn't dusty like everything else in the building. It looked new, I didn't touch it. I didn't even look at it for more than a moment. I just walked past, and the scent of wet stone seemed to follow me. I left the feather where it was, and I knew I wouldn't be able to get the image of it out of my head. The Sally Port doors groaned open, and the morning air hit me. It smelled like exhaust and wet asphalt, a relief after the stale, polished air of the courthouse. Vera was waiting, leaning against her car, arms crossed. She didn't ask what happened. She never did. She just nodded, took my badge, and handed me a flimsy paper with my final paycheck printed on it. I didn't bother arguing about the overtime. It wouldn't have made a difference. The hospital bills weren't going to wait for bureaucratic niceties. I signed the release form, feeling the scratch of the pen on the slick paper. I wanted to ask her about the man, the one by the water cooler. But what would I even say? Hey, Vera, there was a guy who wasn't supposed to be there, and he smelled like whetstone. She'd think I was losing it. And honestly, maybe I was. I told myself it was lack of sleep, the stress of everything. I'd been seeing a therapist, Dr. Ira, for a few months now. He kept talking about cognitive distortions and negative thought patterns. He suggested mindfulness exercises. I tried them. They didn't stop the feeling that something was off. It was just exhaustion. I reasoned, a weird confluence of anxieties manifesting as a phantom visitor and a feather on the floor. A feather, really. I drove straight home. Sarah was already up, making coffee. The smell of it, strong and familiar, usually calmed me. Today, it just felt loud. Everything felt too bright, too sharp. She asked how the night went. I just said it was quiet. I couldn't bring myself to tell her about any of it. She had enough to worry about. The surgery had been a success, thankfully, but the recovery was slow, and the medical bills were a constant weight. I went through the motions of getting ready for bed, trying to ignore the way my skin prickled whenever I closed my eyes. I kept replaying the image of that feather, the way it lay on the linoleum untouched by dust. I found myself checking the locks on the doors twice, then checking them again. It wasn't something I normally did. I slept fitfully, waking up every few hours to a silence that felt wrong. Not the absence of sound, but an active silence, like something was listening. Each time I'd lie there, heart quickening until the feeling passed. I'd find myself staring at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of the popcorn texture. Sometimes, I'd swear I could hear a faint echo, even though the house was completely still. I started applying for other jobs. Anything that didn't involve being alone in a building at night. Warehouse work, delivery driving, even a telemarketing position. Nothing panned out. The medical bills didn't pause while I waited. A few weeks later, I was at the hardware store picking up supplies to fix a leaky faucet. The smell of sawdust and metal polish hit me, and for a split second, I was standing in the courthouse hallway again. The lemon polish, the faint metallic tang of the old building. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the handle of the shopping basket so hard my knuckles turned white. It passed, as it always did. A flicker, a ghost of a sensation. I finished my shopping and went home, trying to shake it off. I saw the job posting online 1 month after that. Courthouse overnight security, immediate opening. The description was identical to the one I'd answered. Same pay, same hours, same requirements. I didn't click on it. I didn't need to. I knew someone would. Someone would walk those halls, find those files, hear that phone ring. Someone would find the feather. Now, whenever I smell lemon polish, I pause. Just for a moment. I don't think about the courthouse consciously. I don't try to. It just happens. A tightness in my chest, a quickening of my pulse, a fleeting image of a dark feather against a pale floor. Then it's gone, and I keep walking.